All right,
Oh my god, this head
everybody.
is so loud. Sorry.
All right, we are getting started here for our next design cast here on the Game Wisdom channel. I'm, of course, Josh Beiser. We've got another fascinating topic for you today. We're going to be discussing the ever challenging art of analyzing game design. What kind of skills are needed and kind of like what the process is like. And joining me tonight is a frequent guest, and he's currently working on the game Epic Tavern and has definitely got experience with analyzing game design. Please welcome Tomo Moriwaki.
Hi guys, this is Tomo Moriwaki, and I've been a game designer for maybe the better part of 20, 22, 23 years, and I'm happy to be here and talk about something I do very frequently, which is analyze the games that are out there,
Mm-hmm.
often analyzing the games that we work on ourselves.
Yep, and it's something that for longtime viewers of mine know that it's something that I've been doing since about 2012 when I started to get really serious with game wisdom and kind of started to talk to game developers. And this is, I think, one of those topics. I think, as we've said before, I don't think it's gotten a lot of credit, both in the mainstream audience. I think even among a lot of starting out, even established developers, in terms of, I guess, like being able to look at a game beyond just the fun factor of it.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the fun factor is a combination of so many
Mm-hmm.
things. Um, and it's actually one of the easiest places to make the first and very dangerous mistake of thinking that fun is any singular thing, right?
Yes.
I mean, part of it is the mystery, right? And mystery and unknown is inherently not any given thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's something that you never stop grappling with, really.
Yeah, and I've heard people describe fun as a four-letter word for them when they're trying to talk about video games and game design in general. Because as you said, everybody has different versions of fun. As my audience knows, I like to play very hard games that borderline on masochistic, and that's fun to me. Like Dark Souls is one of my relaxing games, while for somebody else, it's a game you throw out the window when you lose for like the umpteenth time at a boss.
So true. And although there are different, I mean, some of the kind of academic work that has gone into the idea of fun and some of the game play and game studies stuff in the university, the
Mm-hmm.
kind of new university academic side of game design. They categorize the fun I think that you like, or at least that you described there, is called Fiero. It's the fun of overcoming
Yeah.
obstacles, I guess. Or it's really what it is it's the release after all that frustration gets gratified.
Oh yes, and we've seen a lot of that on the videos and streams here. And one of the reasons why I wanted to use this as a topic, originally it was going to be a video and then we decided to turn this into an actual cast, is that being able to study game design is something that a lot of people claim they're able to do, but I think very few people out there actually understand what this means. And again, I think it's very hard to put into words the fact that we're sitting here breaking down games that for most people it's more or less just like for pure entertainment. We've seen a whole lot of YouTubers and streamers making reaction videos and screaming and yelling at games, but being able to, I think, apply the same critical eye someone would apply to either art or building a car or any kind of like major endeavor is very rare.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Um, I think a big part of it is just that we haven't really the game industry is changing, and the type of things that we're making keeps changing and growing faster than we can kind of codify and come up with like
Mm-hmm.
consistent rules to analyze things. For the most part, there are a lot of consistent ways to approach it, and but it can also be very difficult just because there's so much complexity we're being faced with, and we're not really good at like remembering every step we took. We're good at remembering what we remember, which are the interesting parts.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the harder to remember parts really are strongly contributing to our overall positive or negative experience, really.
Yeah. And I think what you said there is a really good point that the game industry has moved so fast in the past like 40 years that it's very hard for a lot of people to kind of sit down and say, this and this are important parts of game development, or we need to understand what this means. And I know we've had this discussion before about how there's definitely, I think, pushback among developers when you're trying to, I think, set standards or set any kind of like definition or rules about what it means to make a game.
Yeah, I don't think it's but it's not the developer's job to come up
Mm-hmm.
to accept or devise those standards, right? I think in the future, no one will have any question in their mind that kind of the trailing edge, and I don't mean that in a negative way, but kind of the trailing edge of studies and education and the academics of it, um, it's kind of up to them to consume and analyze and find patterns, right? The people that are trying to make something new, that's not, they don't have to know the history.
Mm-hmm.
It almost certainly is helpful, right? But we know plenty of artists who do something because of something very specific that they're feeling and they're trying to share with the audience. And when it works, that's great. And they didn't need to be like professors of game
Mm-hmm.
design or game history to be able to do that. The people that are interested in being game design historians or game or kind of interactive experience historians or analysts of engagement, it's kind of up to them. And I definitely like doing that myself, and so I try to, as much as possible, kind of spend a lot of thought time thinking about those things.
Mm-hmm.
I'm definitely a little bit more of the I mean, I think it's probably just because I'm getting old too. I'm becoming a little more of an academic, I guess, as time goes on.
Yep, and I mean, like for myself, with all the presentations and the books, I think I'm very slowly but surely moved into that space as well. And I think, as we've said, it's very interesting to look at video games like this because, again, for everybody watching this right now, there we go, Shark. For everybody watching this now, nobody was really talking about video games this way 20, 25 years ago, even more than that. It really didn't start to, I think, become a thing. I don't know, would you say arguably maybe like mid thousands, maybe early this past decade?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's right about the time, right at the tail of PS2, I think. The tail of PS2 and the first Xbox. It's going to bother me forever that they called the Xbox after that. That after Xbox 360, Xbox One. But first Xbox, PS2, that era of games, I feel like the audience expanded quite a bit, and the amount of money in the industry was really ballooning, and so that there was a lot more legitimate space for people who aren't developing games directly and aren't publishing them directly to make a life out of being involved in the game industry.
Mm-hmm.
And so now you have people, right, spending time, and that time spent starts, now the patterns are starting to be created. And I know from my own experience kind of in that period of time and maybe in the late 90s that when we analyzed games, I mean, we were, first of all, we were real young, and we were we you know it the depth of analysis and the kind of discipline of that analysis was just not there. We were in a hurry to do our own thing and did as much analysis as made sense at the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And again, like for a lot of people who grew up with the game industry, like late 80s and the 90s was a very experimental time. This was when, as you said, people weren't really thinking about studying design. They were just going, I want to do something like this, and I don't think all the information out there, so I'm just going to make it myself. It was kind of like almost like kind of like the whole idea like rat rods in like the car space. Like I have all these parts laying around. I'm gonna make something with it. I don't know what the end product exactly is going to be, but I know it's something that I want to make.
When and they're still studying game design. They're just studying it by giving it a shot, right? They're studying it by doing something without necessarily knowing how it's going to turn out, without having really like a basis in the patterns of the way people play games, because back then we hardly even had the internet. And so it's not like you could gather mass quantities of user behavior patterns and stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And for like the young people watching this, any of them, they're probably like shocked at that thought about not having any internet or phones there.
Yeah, it was weird. That was back in, I mean, I was still pretty into BBSs, but they were heavily limited by the amount of money it costs to call phones within your local or long distance areas.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that, again, I think there's a, when it comes to this misconception of being able to study game design, and this is something that I hear a lot from like people on YouTube and Twitch, is that playing a lot of video games in of itself is enough to build that analytical approach. And while obviously you need to play a lot of video games, I don't think that is as true as a lot of people claim it is. That if you just sit around all day playing video games, you'll become a master at understanding game design.
Yeah, I think that so first of all, there's a great deal of value, right, in
Mm-hmm.
all the time you put
Mm-hmm.
into understanding a thing. I'm not trying to say that video games are inherently valuable, although I think that kind of all knowledge is sort of inherently valuable, let's say. But more importantly, your knowledge of video games is growing every second you spend playing any game, really, right? But that doesn't mean you have identified the patterns or that your own consciousness can kind of recall all those details, right? You know someone who's played a lot of games because you could just describe a small little
Mm-hmm.
experience. Like we could describe the feeling of getting tired because getting to the next level is taking longer and longer and longer, let's say, right? That's
Mm-hmm.
a very specific feeling. But anyone who's played a lot of RPGs, they know that feeling deep in their heart. So when
Mm-hmm.
you say it, they're like, "Oh, I know exactly how that feels." And
Mm-hmm.
by being able to recall that feeling, they're recalling something very true about a game's experience. Um, I think that you need to take that discipline next step to kind of self-reflect and analyze your own experience and draw conclusions and make claims and organize your thought process.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, the first time you do that, it's not going to be that good,
Oh,
but it'll get
yes.
better.
Mm-hmm. So here's a question for you, and I'm going to pose it to the chat as well, because I was thinking about this as I was coming up with the topics for our cast, and about gamers or specific audiences who I think inherently are good at analyzing game design the way that we're talking. And my question is, do you think that either speedrunners or people who do esports, do you think they have similar skills or even equal skills in terms of analyzing game design?
I absolutely think so. But it's for the speedrunners especially.
Yeah.
This just the raw number of times they play a thing, like it's you can almost think of like studying and writing about game design is like trying to get more out of what you already know, right? I'm self-reflecting, I'm describing my experience, and I'm trying to draw conclusions. If for those people, like, and we know video games maybe does this a little more than some of the other mediums, they've played it so much, like the literally everything about that game is coded into like their DNA or at least their brain's experience. So what they've developed, like they have all that raw data. They're right on, like it would be much easier for that person to take the next step to start analyzing what they know than for someone who doesn't have that play experience, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think for me, I would put speedrunners maybe just a little bit above the esports line because, as you said, like when they're playing a game at that level, they are trying to break. They're trying to understand. They're seeing behind the curtain and trying to figure out all the ways this game comes together. And like I always love it when I hear like speedrunners talk about things, like hitboxes, manipulating triggers, and scripting. Like I don't know if they understand things more beyond that capability, but in terms of I think again like understanding the mechanics and the systems behind what they're seeing on screen, I think it comes a little bit better to them than it does the esports line.
Well, I think the esports are at a small disadvantage in that particular
Yeah.
regard because they have to be so centrally
Yeah.
fixated on what the best possible strategy will be,
Mm-hmm.
right? That their goal is to win. And so they'll be more intimate with those strategies, but so often is the case in games that the dominant or overpowered strategies aren't always a good reflection of what the underlying game is about.
Yep. And that could easily segue into a talk about multiplayer balance. That's like another hour and a half I think we could throw on top of this. And yeah, it's something that I've talked to other developers about who've been building multiplayer based games and understanding that you always have to be really careful when you're dealing with the top 10% of your audience because while they have the greatest understanding, they're also trying to get the best advantage. And it sometimes is very hard to, I think, separate those two.
Yeah, I almost feel like you wanna. There are not enough games out there that are like built to gratify the min-maxers and the exploiters, right? If we could just like, I've been thinking about trying to, what is the best platform to basically be a exploitative player's wet dream, and convince everyone who's playing just to exploit harder and celebrate the the cleverest game breakers as as uh as the kings of that experience.
I think the Disgaea franchise may be the closest to that.
Nice, totally.
Now, Brian asked a question I think is a really interesting one. I think that will also be a good segue into talking more about the skills of analyzing game design. He said that he gets most of his insight from watching Let's Plays that allow him to cover more ground in terms of seeing mechanics and action. Do you think a person can get the full understanding of a game through watching a Let's Play, or is there something vital about going hands on yourself? And I can certainly have some thoughts on this, but I'll toss over to you first.
Oh, well, I was just going to say that I mean, you can get the full understanding of a game. I'm almost certain, and all the more easier if the person who's doing the Let's Play has as like a great way of kind of describing, especially both balancing describing their experience as they go through it, especially as a first time player. Oh my, uh, as well as well as talking about the mechanics and kind of expressing their knowledge about games in general. Um, but there are some things that are really hard
Yeah.
to kind of deeply understand without getting your hands on the experience. Like, um, when it comes to timing and action, responsiveness,
Mm-hmm.
some of those feelings you can't really experience those feelings without trying to use the controller along with that experience. And
Yeah.
some of that experiential data can be really helpful, especially if you're going to make a game like, let's say you're going to make a game like Ninja Gaiden or something, right?
Yeah.
That becomes a huge part of what you're trying to put together. So, in which case, you really would need a lot of hands-on experience with those kinds of games.
Yeah. And I agree with you. I think the very best Let's Players can almost be a good analog to playing the game yourself. Like if they can actually explain to you, I am doing this because of these elements on screen, or I can explain how this game is looking, how I'm processing it, you can get a lot out of that. But I do think like we're talking about like action or player skill focused titles, you do need to, I think, have your hands on the controller. To, again, as you said, understand, the responsiveness of the controls. How does it feel in your hands? Like a really good example that would be the difference between watching like a Kaizo player and doing Kaizo games yourself. Like for those of you who remember, I tried to play Invictus and Grand Poo World 2, and despite playing a ton of platformers and watching those speedrunners, I couldn't even make it halfway through the first level. And it is such a different thing. And they even say this a lot on the speedrunners that, yes, I'm making this look easy, but it took me like 1,500 hours and probably like 20,000 deaths at this game to get that muscle memory in place.
Yeah, but we have to also be careful to separate out the ability to play the game
Hmm.
versus the ability to understand it.
Yeah.
Um, I think that, you know, when you start analyzing an action game, especially, or one that is very sensitive to timing, let's say, um, you need to start building kind of like that second by second model of what the player could be thinking, should be thinking, and then whether or not their reactions are fast enough and how much practice, like maybe an average person would need to be able to succeed 50% of the time or get to the point where they can succeed 100% of the time, right? And you start imagining how many times they do an action, how long they play the game, the information they see on the screen, whether that's giving them the right information to respond to, and a lot of the fundamentals of that you can derive without getting your hands on the controller. You can make get and you can make the you basically you can make the framework without the hands-on experience. But the hands-on experience now gives you the raw data that you're going to start behaving or working off of, right? You can think like, you know, playing Devil May Cry and getting an S rank on all the levels, you can start making some guesses about how long people will take or how much how much skill they need to build. But then if you've never played it, you'll just be saying that people tend to. But the
Mm-hmm.
moment you play it, now you'll know all the pieces of why, at least for yourself, and then you can start working those more subtle angles.
Yeah. And I think that leads when if you don't have that hands-on experience, you're just going by like the numbers or somebody else watching. It leads to those cases I think where you have an idea that seems like it's good on paper, but doesn't quite work in execution. And I think a really good example would be the original version of Diablo 3. That I remember developers in interviews said that nobody on the design team could beat the game at that level. And I know people will say, oh, that means it must be a hardcore, amazing experience. I just think that's not even balanced at all. The people who design the systems can't even figure out how to beat it, then there's an issue there. And ultimately, it turned out that it was an issue, and they had to completely rebalance the game several months later.
Yeah, and I think they might have just gotten very caught up in some of their kind of numerical scaling theories and the impact it'll have on the player. But if you don't go there yourself, you'll have less. You'll basically have less confidence, or there'll be more uncertainty. So your guess might will have a lower chance of being accurate. It's like, what does it feel like to play a game for 1,000 hours? Well, if you haven't played it for 1,000 hours, you don't even have one
Mm-hmm.
true experiential sample point from yourself. To be fair, how many games can you do that with? I mean, you can do that with your own game because, I mean, at least if it takes years to make, you spend
Mm-hmm.
a god awful amount of time playing that game. But at the same time, you're also playing it in under these conditions that don't match the player's experience either, and so you can really get caught up in believing in an untrue thing because you've spent so much time kind of in a state that doesn't give you the right kind of information about a particular game. And I think that that that's an important piece of game analysis because we bring a lot to the table ourselves when we're looking at anything. And if you don't know what you're bringing to the table, then you'll have more difficulty analyzing something kind of dispassionately and from a neutral standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you'll be able to give your own opinions just as good as anyone can, but you won't. It won't. It'll lack a certain amount of universality in terms of the way other people will experience it.
And before we talk a little bit more about kind of like the skills or our own individual process when it comes to analyzing game design, one last question for this part I want to pose to you. Like, we hear this all the time when it comes to people reviewing games or covering games in terms of their respective background in the genre. And as we all know, there is a big difference between playing, thousands of hours of games in general versus playing 1,000 hours of this one specific genre, one specific franchise. So, do you think that when it comes to studying game design or analyzing it, that is it more important to focus on like do you think somebody who, let's say, spends 10,000 hours studying games is better than somebody who spent 10,000 hours on this one game? Like, do you think like these skills are maybe like, I guess, genre transferable, if there's like, for lack of a better term?
Well, I mean, I think that just the very nature of the fact that so many kind of interesting and new experiences are being created, and we don't know where the game industry will be in the future, that you got to be focusing on the genre transferable elements of your analysis. That said, someone who specializes is going to have advantages in that specialization over someone who doesn't. At the same time, I think I can make a pretty strong argument that if you don't distill your knowledge into some basic rules that should be universally applicable,
Mm-hmm.
you might not have like a clear understanding of where you're even sitting. And so I think that there needs to be some foundation of universal understanding about game design and games and the kind of
Mm-hmm.
experiences the players have when they play them. And then once that foundation is established, then a specialization within a genre or even a specific individual game certainly offers that person who's done that study an advantage in that particular analysis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do agree with you on that. That you need to have some ground level foundation in terms of what your skills are, what you need to look at. Because again, like we said, there are people who will spend thousands of hours on an individual game, but then they don't really have the thought process or the understanding to say more than, I really like this game or I really hate this game.
or that this is the best game of its type.
Hmm.
But if they only know that type, they're now it is the best game of that type for people that only play that type of
Yeah.
game, right? You see, like there's so many categorizations of our own thinking that need to be kind of brought to bear in our conclusions.
Yeah. And I think with that, that is a perfect segue into this next topic, because I really want to talk about kind of the process that we use to break down these games, and this could either be a very short section or very long. We'll have to see. And then after that, we'll try and pick a game that we've both played and see if we can apply our own individual thoughts on it to kind of tear it apart, I guess.
This
So,
will be as long as you want it to be, by the way, because this part I have a lot to say about, but yeah, I don't even know where to, I definitely don't know where to end.
yeah, me neither. So, I guess I'll start first and then I'll toss it over to you. So,
Sounds good.
the first thing that I do when I pick up a game, I immediately look at the UI itself. Is the Are the controls easy to understand? Can I hold the gamepad or put my hands on the keyboard or mouse and very quickly pick up, okay, what am I doing? The next thing I always take a look at is the UI on screen. Because I've played so many strategy and kind of more complicated games where, I take my eyes off the keyboard, I look up, and I just see a mess of icons, and I have no idea what it is I'm looking at. And from there, if the game still has me, I start actually playing it. And the big thing for me is always trying to identify what the core gameplay loop is. And it sounds, I think, easier than it sounds easier than it is. Because, for instance, if we're playing a platformer, it'll just be a case of. Oh, wait. Tom, are you still there? I'm not. Oh, I'm sorry. It looked like you were frozen there for a second. um, because, for instance, you can look at a platformer and think, oh, I'm just going to be running and jumping. But there could be more to it. Is there puzzle elements? What are the skills I'm going to be needing? Is this going to be more precision based? Is it more story based, etc.? And then, usually, a big one for me is I try to extrapolate out what is the long term game that this design is going to present. Like, what am I going to be doing hour 3, 10, 30, whatever? And whether or not this individual gameplay system or these individual mechanics are going to be enough to keep me invested in it. And this is why, like, for a lot of people who watch me, I will usually make a determining factor whether or not I'm going to keep playing a game within maybe 15 to 30 minutes. And then once I go past that point, usually, unless like something major happens that just completely ruins the experience for me, I'm all in to see where this game goes.
That sounds like a pretty solid approach. I mean, I think that's a makes a very sensible starting point. I mean, especially with the respect to the UI stuff, because I mean, obviously, everything that you can do starts getting messaged in terms of what you start seeing,
Mm-hmm.
and all your available options are an essential kind of beginning point towards starting to figure out what they want you to do, right? Whatever they make.
Yeah.
My brain starts with the concept of the voice of the author. It's maybe a bit more of a writery
Mm-hmm.
type of concept, but it's straightforward, right? You look at any expression from anybody. Maybe a better way of putting it is trying to understand what the motive is of the creators of whatever it is you're engaging with,
Mm-hmm.
but just kind of holistically soak in what's happening. Like if there's a splash screen, what energy is there in that splash screen? What is the choice of their logo? And start just this kind of like really fun part at the beginning of the play experience where your eyes are as wide open as possible and you're trying to soak in every tiny little piece of information. Did they have a little sparkle in the lower right corner of the screen for their logo because that means something? I wonder if that might mean something. Is there something that's similar in the title screen, or the way the words of the beginning of the game comes up, or if does it start with like an image of a person's face? Like all those details just start spinning your mind on overdrive and just looking for any kinds of connections, and from those connections looking for any pattern that goes like, I think this is going to be a love story, and that there and a the monster, and the monster isn't the bad guy. Like that's the vibe I'm getting. I wonder if that's actually the vibe. And now I'm kind of like asking questions of what the author's trying to get across to me, and then cutting away imagine scenarios as I get more and more specific information as I play the game, and going like, oh, maybe what they really mean is this. Maybe what they really mean is this.
Mm-hmm.
Now that's kind of at kind of the higher product level, because that's kind of the theory is that that's the experience that the creators were trying to get delivered to the player. And you know, when I was a lot younger, I felt like I approached games much more mechanically in their
Mm-hmm.
it's like, how many choices do I have on this controller? Which of those choices do what? Are they arranged in a way that is elegant for my hand's use? And I still think a
Mm-hmm.
lot of those thoughts, but those are inside the bubble of what the larger um, intent for my for the interactive experience I'm trying to deliver to you.
Mm-hmm. And, oh,
Go ahead. Go ahead. No, no,
I
go
was
ahead.
going to say that I think what you said there was really apt in terms of understanding the author, understanding the intent of the designer. I think that is a very essential point when it comes to analyzing game design. Because, like we said, there are plenty of people who will sit there and scream, this game is stupid, developers are lazy, why the hell did they do this? They're just a bunch of idiots, they don't know what they're talking about. And those kinds of discussions don't help things. And going back to I think our previous section when we were discussing speedrunners, I think this is one of the reasons why I like to look why I think speedrunners are really great, at least the basic level of this, because they're able to look beyond the curtain. I always like to use that expression, seeing the man behind the curtain, when it comes to understanding that these mechanics, and by extension the design and the UI, they're not thrown together. Again, like any developer watching this, the process isn't just throwing things against the wall, seeing what sticks, and putting into your game. There is a concentrated effort to build a unique and a very specific experience. And to understand game design, you have to start looking at, why are these things here? It's not there because the developer was mean, or they hated you. Like, that's not that wasn't the purpose to have this thing there. They have an intent for this specific mechanic or this specific level, and you have to, or if you want to start learning game design, you have to start being able to understand that.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can make an argument that if someone isn't trying to craft an experience for you, then maybe you're not getting anything out of trying to analyze it. But I don't necessarily think that's true. You're imagining all the things that could have been said through what you're experiencing. Many times games have elements. In fact, no, every game has elements that have been implemented that don't fit the overall message, that they
Mm-hmm.
were kind of put in because without too much thought, right? There was just uh,
Mm-hmm.
a feature or a visual of some sort was just put in because that we didn't think too far into it. It was just the obvious thing to do. And maybe that obvious thing that we chose for
Mm-hmm.
some players evoked a particular thought, and they're convinced that what we really meant was something else. Those accidents happen. They happen all over the place, and that's kind of why you got to be looking at as broad a set of the information that you're being presented with in the game experience as possible, so you can come up with these theories about what they're trying to do. And there's a second step you need to take, like identification of their agenda is step one. And that you obviously you can't know it right out the gate. So yeah, the more you play, the more you can come up with a more sound theory about what the agenda is. But then as you develop a firmer understanding of that agenda, you're comparing all of their choices against whether it executes on that agenda well. So it's
Mm-hmm.
like, this game is all about making you upset and frustrated, and I'm never upset and frustrated. I'm
Mm-hmm.
certain that's what they want because of all these things they said, but I just never felt that way. And I'm like, failure. They tried to do something and it didn't play out. And then on top of that, there could be a separate thing where it's like, but I actually enjoyed the game quite a bit because the things that I did do work for me,
Mm-hmm.
right? There's all these weird contaminated thoughts that'll all mesh together. And
Yeah.
if you don't really spend mental energy to separate that out into their pieces, you'll get your your personal feelings will infect your analytical thoughts
Mm-hmm.
about what you imagine them to be thinking, and what you imagine them to be thinking might infect your personal thoughts because you don't like what it is they're thinking, rather than analyzing whether they're executing on what they're trying
Mm-hmm.
to do effectively. Like, all that stuff gets in the way of, gets in the way truly of any kind of art analysis in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah.
But it is also true of video games.
Yeah. And I think that is another really great point. And again, it goes back to that idea of, somebody who is the super hardcore fan of this specific game, and they say it's the best game ever. Is it really the best game ever for everybody, or is it just the best game ever for that one specific person? And you'll see this with, the extreme either critics or defenders of a game, that no matter if you say you like or dislike something, they're going to say either, you're wrong, or, you're not liking it enough for my taste. And
Totally, totally.
it is very hard to do that because, again, not everybody is going to be a master of every genre. Again, I just owe myself up to probably Shark typing in a whole little spiel right there in that sentence there. And it's important to understand that when it comes to, like we said, to analyzing these games, there is a basic set of skills. There's a basic foundation for what you can look at a game that is universal. Whether you love visual novel games or whether you are the best Dark Souls player, there is still a baseline that you need to be able to explain to people. Otherwise, it's just all, as you said, it's just like 100% my personal opinion.
And you have to hold on to your own personal opinion for sure.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what you think is your best is the best data you have access to, right? Your own response pattern in real time with you paying attention to how you're feeling. You can't do that with anyone else's point of view. You get one high fidelity story, and that's your own, what goes on in your head, and so you can't abandon that. In fact, you need, and you should try to clean it up as much as possible because it is your best, highest fidelity story in your life. But that's just the starting point, right? You want to imagine as many stories as possible, understand other people's points of view. Maybe a good starting point, by the way, is just think the opposite of what you think.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody is generally thinks the opposite of you, and you can kind of get an idea of what they're like by just all the things that you like, you don't like, and all the things you don't like, you do like. Strangely enough, your opposite is closer to you than any of the surrounding other angles of deflection.
Mm-hmm. And going back to what you were saying a few minutes ago regarding the developer's intent, and then seeing whether or not they succeed in that, we could say the same thing of the horror genre, and how many developers try to create that horrific experience, and they may end up making a really solid game, but it may not be a really solid horror design or a really solid way of getting the player scared. And again, like when we start talking about games at this level, it's very hard, I think, for a lot of people to understand. I think getting away from the quote unquote like fanboy elements of it, because I've looked at games that I didn't like, and I never use words like, developers were stupid or, this game wasn't fun. But I talk about issues I had with the mechanics not working. And people will immediately attack you saying, oh, you're not good at this game. Or, you just, you had a bias against the genre. So that's why you didn't like it. And when we're trying to talk about games like this, it becomes very difficult for, I think separate what elements what elements the person is going to be focusing on. Because there are people that you can have a review that's 90% positive and you say one bad thing, and they'll assume that you just hated this entire game. You weren't ever a fan, so on and so on.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to public communication about this stuff, it's a little bit tricky. From a marketing standpoint, right, a unanimously positive statement
Oh, yes.
is more attractive to a potential audience member or a customer, right? But if the goal is to transfer accurate information, that it is unanimously positive, almost just invalidates it as good information, right? And there really is no game that is without flaw, and most games are deeply soaked in a number of flaws. Even the best games, but the best, like, because you don't, a game isn't good because it lacks flaws, right? A game is good is because it does something special and it does that thing well. In fact, if anything, very frequently a new and interesting, extremely high quality game experience for many people may very well carry some of the crappiest flaws ever. It's
Mm-hmm.
just, and maybe as a byproduct of spending so much energy to get what it got right.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Now, the question then becomes, if you're going to analyze it against the agenda of the developer, you have to be able to see, like, okay, well, maybe this thing that isn't executed well is secondary to the experience, or tertiary to the experience,
Yeah.
or wholly peripheral to the experience. And
Mm-hmm.
that if you fixate too much on it as a problem, is it getting in the way of your enjoyment of the other thing? And you have to kind of experiment a bit. Like, you have to kind of
Yeah.
pretend that this bad part's bad, and it's eclipsing the good parts of the game. How is that working for you, right? You use your own response and experience, playing the game as your best data for analyzing it.
Mm-hmm.
And there's been plenty of cases where it's like, this bad thing that's bad about the game, I'm pretty sure is peripheral to the game, but it is kind of ruining it for me because of the type of gamer I am.
Yeah.
But my best guess is actually that for your typical audiences, that's partly why this game is so successful, because this thing that's bad has no significant negative influence on the thing that is good about the game.
Yeah.
And I mean, visual novel becomes an interesting example, right? Let's say if you don't like reading and you don't care what is written, you're never going to find what's cool in a visual
Yeah.
novel. Or at least you won't be able to differentiate them from each other.
Yeah. And I think to add on to that, I think what you said is a really good point. That if you're studying game design, you do have your own personal bias. You have your own personal thoughts. Again, like for myself, I am not a visual novel kind of person. Like I'm not a story first kind of player. But in that same breath, I can still sit there and understand why somebody enjoys this game. I can say, so and so didn't work for me, but if you're a fan of this, there you go. This is the perfect game for you. And it's very hard, I think, for a lot of people to, I think, get past that by the fact that if I don't like something, then inherently it must be a bad thing. But that's not how things normally work.
Yeah, I think, well, I mean, and if you're going to study game design, I think one of the very first things you're going to run into is that, you know, user segmentation and trying to understand groups of people is easily half of the game of the analysis. You're like, this game would be great for, 15% of people that like CRPGs.
Mm-hmm.
But if you never played a CRPG, what is the chances that you'll like it?
Yeah.
And it's like that. Oh, I don't have good information. I can't tell what all the people. I don't know well enough the set of humans that are people who have not played CRPGs. Let's say, and I go, okay, well maybe I'll think about how about people that have played Clash of Clans, because that's a lot of people, and people
Mm-hmm.
that have played League of Legends. My best guess, if I analyze those games deeply and come up with some ideas about what it, you can think of like what's good about it as like its power curve, and it's like, oh well, League of Legends and Clash of Clans have some similarities in their power curve, but a lot of differences, right? And then I can start imagining mobile users and scattered across the globe, and young men playing League of Legends, and start making some guesses. That's the other thing you got to do, by the way. Game analysis requires you to make judgments. And
Mm-hmm.
if you are bad at them, then they will be bad judgments, but you will not get better unless you do them.
Yeah.
And that's a tough thing to go through. It sucks to go, my best guess is this, and to know deep down that it's a terrible guess.
Oh yes. And again, I think it goes back to being able to understand or try to figure out the intent of the developer. That if this developer is making the best damn attempt at making a League of Legends or a MOBA, yes, I may not like it or I may love it or hate it, but I can in some way tell, is this a good version of this genre? Like if it's a MOBA game where it doesn't matter how you play, you're always gonna lose, then obviously, the intent didn't match execution. But if this is, like a super high challenging, skill focused game, even if I am horrible at it, I can tell that somebody who really likes Dota or LoL or any of those is going to find some enjoyment in it.
That brings up another good point. The moment it comes to my mind, I'll just immediately just throw off a chat message to someone I know loves the game or loves that genre, and just
Yeah.
ask them if they know anything about the game and what their thoughts are, and then use that as just an additional data point. So it generally works for people that like that kind of game, because I'm not a huge MOBA player myself,
Mm-hmm.
and so when it comes to comparing MOBAs against each other, sometimes it's I don't have the right tools, and then I'll use a number of friends and their opinion on it. it's the deferred processing, because it's like I'm not going to put 1,000 hours into League of Legends, but I know a number of people that have.
Hmm. Yep. And talking about games that we're not like fans of or that are we're not particularly versed in, there's one part about this I definitely wanted to bring up. Do you think it is worthwhile to play games that aren't your strong suit, or games that are genres that you inherently don't like when it comes to analyzing game design? Because there are some people who feel that you know it's essentially wasting the time on a genre that you don't have, I guess, enough of a background or enough of an interest to really build a skill set around.
So yeah, I mean, my personal take on it is that that is essential. If you are unable to get through your, if you're unable to overcome your dislike of a thing,
Mm-hmm.
that says a whole lot more about you than it does about it. And if you
Mm-hmm.
want to be able to analyze it, then you're going to need to be able to get over that. I mean, I had this story from like 2007 where I had so much contempt for Facebook games, Farmville and Cityville in particular, let's say, um, and say ridiculous things like those people shouldn't be allowed to spend money on that
Mm-hmm.
game. But there were over 100 million monthly active users, and those numbers didn't make sense back in those days. So I made the commitment to play Cityville until I liked it. By the way, that took about 200 hours, spread out over the course of about 4 months, 5 months. And I did come to enjoy the game, and what I enjoyed about that game in the end ended up sharing almost nothing. What I enjoyed about every other game I ever liked. So
Mm-hmm.
you could think of that as I developed the skill of liking a new type of thing.
Mm-hmm.
In the end, you can't measure a thing based on what it does wrong. You have to measure it on what it does right. The
Yep.
things that it does wrong can pull it down, but the things that it does wrong has no bearing on its ultimately what it is.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to practice your ability to like things. If there's something you cannot like, then that just means that there's a dark spot in your understanding
Yep.
of the human experience in interactive software.
Yep. And like we said, being able to understand why somebody else would like this. Because if you just sit there and say, I don't like this, so therefore this game is bad, then as you said, it becomes more of that blind spot on you rather than on the game as a whole.
I agree. Yeah, and I mean, I honestly, I have this kind of like kind of weird esoteric theory about my like and my dislike, as described as tools. My
Mm-hmm.
like is a high resolution, very nuanced measuring tool,
Mm-hmm.
and I spray it on things when I want to understand these high resolution, very nuanced things that create like in people. And my dislike is a little bit more of a crude tool. It's still something that my intellect can use better or worse. Like, why don't I like it? Or what
Mm-hmm.
is it that they did wrong? And I can get into some like really
Oh
detailed
yes.
description about the types of errors that are made or about misalignments in choices that are made to for one system versus another. I have all these words for it. In fact, that's most of our kind of like
Mm-hmm.
intellectual critical mind. uh, a lot of us are good at that,
Mm-hmm.
but we don't. We almost have an aversion to kind of pushing energy down our like channel, thinking that maybe it's too pure or it's impossible to master the same way we mastered some of our critique skills. But in practice, especially over the last 10 or so years, I feel like that it's exactly the same type of tool, just used for different purposes.
Yeah. And I think being able to explain why something doesn't work for you beyond just saying I don't like it is a very crucial skill for game design.
In fact, you don't have like in my today's world, you don't have to explain why you like something, but you do have to explain if you why you don't like it. And
Mm-hmm.
that's partially because why you like something is more complicated than why you don't like something.
Mm-hmm.
Generally speaking, when something is wrong, it's easy to describe what is wrong about it.
Mm-hmm.
It's a low processing, uh, a low processor requirement thread.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas trying to describe what you like about something, we've all experienced it, where it's like, no, it's at the edge of my awareness. There's something wonderful
Mm-hmm.
about this, and it is too complicated or too nuanced or too subtle for me to put into words. That is easy. That
Mm-hmm.
happens a lot in the things that we like a lot. And it's partially why we don't like it when people challenge it, because we can't articulate what we like so much about it, so we feel like we're kind of failing at defending the goodness of what we enjoy so much.
And
Whereas at
that's
the same time, like all bazillion of us can get into a room and complain about stuff.
oh yes, I'm sure nobody in chat's ever complained about my game playing skills on stream before there. But yeah, it's a really great point about like especially on this top about game design. Like something I always say about UI that if your UI is great, nobody's going to complain about it. You know, it just works for them, and they can't really explain why. When it doesn't work, you're going to get entire message boards of people yelling about your game is horrible, it's hard to play, you know, what the hell is wrong with you, etc., etc.
Yeah, for sure. By the way, it is 2:11, at least over on my side.
Yeah.
So that gives us 19-ish minutes before we get to the 1.5 hour mark. And I know we do have some bit of timetable, although considering how the conversation has gone, I'm almost feeling like that this is the first video about game analysis, and maybe the next one should be about specific games that we can then analyze together.
Yep.
Because like
I'm.
20 minutes, that's maybe not enough time. Like
Yeah.
Slay the Spire, we were considering talking about
Mm-hmm.
Slay the Spire. Magnificent game, really, and
Mm-hmm.
all kinds of things we could talk about with respect to trying to analyze that game. Oh, although that does bring up something important I
Mm-hmm.
wanted to bring up
Yeah.
in terms of the generics or the approach to analysis. There is, aside from voice of the author, that's just the starting point, right? Because you're trying to get the highest level vibe
Yeah.
in your head and getting a process or a thread running, trying to analyze it and trying to identify it and so on. But there are a lot of other things with respect to a game, like what is it? Is this the kind of game that's you sit here and play for 5 hours at a stretch? Is this the kind of game that you play for 15 minutes and it's time to do something different? Like
Mm-hmm.
start analyzing there are like a number of kind of like, if we want to give it the stink of mobile development, we talk about like a lot of KPIs that you can start
Mm-hmm.
kind of putting into your bag of tricks. Session length, degree of timing sensitive, like I mentioned before. Um, how like how much adrenaline is in the experience, and whether it's trying to how it's managing what you don't know about the game yet.
Mm-hmm.
The uncertainty factor. Some games have a lot of uncertainty, and
Yeah.
it's really like, like a game that is centrally focused around discovery sometimes doesn't tell you the rules because that's part of what you're supposed to do. Is that game Does that game do a bad job of tutorialing? I mean, out on the surface, yes. But if that all feeds into promoting a exploratory uh, stance for the player and getting a lot of good out of it, like it leads to something, like that
Mm-hmm.
they're managing your interfacing with uncertainty, then now it can be successful. And maybe that's not everybody's cup of tea, but
Yeah.
it's one of the many axes you really want to be thinking about. And once you start taking those main kind of KPIs, I guess, you can start creating shapes. And that's when you start talking about that this game is um, uh, the kind of game like roguelike, we'll say in general, has this thing where it's like you just can't guarantee that you're going to win,
Mm-hmm.
and there's very little certainty from moment to moment. But that's okay because you'll play through this over and over and over again. You'll get acquainted with that uncertainty and its nuance.
Yeah.
Another kind of game, though, let's say it was like a storytelling experience where all the events are totally fixed and the experience revolves around delivering that moment the best that it can be delivered in that moment. It has no uncertainty.
Yeah.
You kind of just sit and experience it. Maybe there's some interactivity there, but it was put there in this case just so you have something to do while I say something interesting to you.
Yeah.
And I'm not judging either of those experiences
Mm-hmm.
better or worse, just very different approaches. And then as you start keying into the choices that developers make, you can start blocking them into these categories.
And I think for myself, like going back to as I was talking about my process earlier, like one of the things I always like to do is once I start seeing what the core gameplay loop and what the secondary systems are, you said, I start to extrapolate out. Okay, what is this game going to actually be focusing on over how many minutes, hours, days of time? Like for instance, I picked up Zombie Army 4 last night. I got that as a press key. That is the latest in the Sniper Elite zombie killing spin-off. And one of the things they did with this one was add in a whole lot of persistence and progression systems to the game that kind of occupied the back end of it. So as I'm playing the game, I'm starting to think, okay, so these systems are eventually going to lead towards this point of view. And one of the things that, and I've said this before about why I've gotten a little bit tired of like AAA games, is that a lot of AAA games tend to, I feel like, front load their mechanics and systems. That I'll see everything the game has to offer within the first hour, 2 hours of play, and then it's just how many times can we just spin this wheel again and again and again until either the player gets tired or we tell the rest of the story.
Yeah. AAA games, they follow a much more standard form, right? They have less wiggle room.
Yes.
They spend so much more money on their development that they have to be very careful about the risks they take. And it's not as good a look anymore. Back when there wasn't things
Mm-hmm.
like mobile, and for a brief period of time Facebook, or things like those web portals like Armor and Congregate
Mm-hmm.
and Steam. I mean,
Yep.
basically, there are these everything other than console is just this like wellspring of variety and all these risks people are taking trying out these new ideas. And the big console's like, we're gonna spend $60 million on this. You're gonna make the last game, and you're gonna get to add one thing to it.
Mm-hmm.
It better be good, damn it.
Yeah.
Better be the right thing, or else you're gonna lose your job.
Mm-hmm. And it, like we've said many times over, like the last decade has just been massive for the rise of the indie. I did my recent top 10 list, and I put indie development. I think that was number two. That, as you said, like the amount of quality and unique experiences have just flourished in the independent space because they have that opportunity to wiggle. They can experiment with something like Untitled Goose Game. Like there is no AAA studio that you. I don't think you could pitch that to EA and say, "Give us, $10 million and we'll make Untitled Goose Game."
Although, I do think at the same time that it would probably be a trivial expenditure for them to do
Yeah.
things like maybe bankroll a few $100,000 worth of prototype,
Mm-hmm.
and then to build maybe a department in the company that takes those prototypes and runs them through user tests to analyze which ones evoke a good response from the audience.
Yeah.
I mean, those big companies have the advantage of resources and scale, and they don't always take the right kind of advantage of them. That
Mm-hmm.
that none of the old big publishers has the best data center on earth at this point is a lost opportunity.
Yeah.
Basically, newcomers came to the stage and they own all the data now, and
Mm-hmm.
that leaves our old North American great console publishers behind the curve to some extent.
Yeah. And as a quick time check on my end, I would say, maybe 20, 25 minutes left, and then I do have to get for another call. But again, Tomo said, like he's available to come back on, so I'm not forcing him to come back on for another chat. But yeah, um,
Totally, totally.
I would love to do this as like a regular series, or do at least a few more casts on this kind of topic.
Yeah, I mean, I could totally imagine just like, maybe every other week or something, just picking a game and really kind of maybe practicing kind of a methodology of breaking it down and analyzing it,
Yeah.
and then trying to find some stability and consistency in the way it's analyzed. Because
Yeah.
more often than not, I'll be analyzing games with the perspective of what I'm working on. And so depending on what I'm working on, it really changes how I analyze it.
Yeah.
Um, you know, like I didn't really have any tools, or not at least not any frequently used tools for analyzing the storytelling of a game before I started working on Epic Tavern. To be fair, I've been doing that now for the better part of 4 years, and so now there's a lot going on. In fact, if anything, that it's that experience that kind of led me to that and children going to school and trying to explain to them about
Yeah.
them writing their papers and stuff. But it's the writing angle that kind of, I think, brought that to bear,
Yeah.
right? And I think it was also in that period of time that I shifted my mentality towards a much more universal attitude about the art that humans create. That it is
Hmm.
all much more similar to each other than it is different from each other, and that
Yeah.
medium or genre or platform is more business than art.
Yeah. And I think there's another topic right there about just how much genres have really like taken from each other. Like the basic DNA has really been spread around over the last like 15, 20 years with the rise of adding everything from RPG mechanics in racing games and first person shooters to even this idea of the souls like is now a major genre. And I've said this before, like, one of the things I always like to do with these games, it's something I've gotten really good at, is being able to see, okay, what inspiration did this developer have when they were making this game? And again, that goes back to, as we were saying, like, trying to derive, like, what was their intent? What was this goal that they were trying to achieve? Um, we recently did a play of the game Scourgebringer on stream, and, like, within, like, 10 minutes of that play, I was like, this reminds me a lot of Monolith and Flinthook. And then like I got comments saying, "Hey, this game looks a lot like Monolith." I'm like, "Yeah, I said that like 10 times on that stream." And regarding doing like a every other week or whatever uh, cast or mini cast about this stuff, I am certainly game. I don't think anyone in chat would complain about hearing us rant about or rant about game design for an extra hour a week there.
Board fan says, "It's okay, Tomo. I know he's forcing you to say you want
You
this
don't
and
see
that."
the laser, the gun sight in the background.
Um. Oh wait, I had a thought there. Um. Oh, board fan snark occupied my thought process. Although I find board fan snark entertaining and good. Um. Yeah, I think that well, the consistency would be interesting, right? Trying to develop kind of a standard form for analysis. And I know there are a number of people out there that have their methodology and their process. Um, generally, the people that can do that though kind of aren't as busy as a lot of devs usually are. And to be fair, there's a bit of a fallacy that you don't have time to analyze because like it's like a war and reconnaissance analogy. It's like you have time to figure out what's going on
Yeah,
because if you don't know what's going on, you're just going to make mistakes.
yep, definitely. I guess again, like if we're not careful, we could just sit here and rant for hours on end about this topic. There, there is one thing that I wanted to bring up. We'll see if this will be my final question or if anything else comes up in chat. But there's a tendency among people to, I think, immediately discount simplistic or easy to understand games. Again, the stigma behind mobile games is a really good example. And then those are the people who will immediately, love or gravitate towards complicated or difficult to learn games. Like I've gotten people who've hated me because I dare to say bad things about La Mulana. There you go. Get help there, people. Who love La Mulana, Let It Die, or people who will, defend to the death everything and anything there is about a Dark Souls game. Even if there are legitimate issues or legitimate complaints, we've used the term get good, I think, at least 7 times in chat in the last hour or so. So, from a design standpoint, what are your thoughts on, like, I guess, the analytical process when it comes to either super difficult games and casual games? And do you have, I guess, like a different approach, or as you were saying earlier, like a different tool that you would use depending upon the design of it?
Well, I mean, I'd have some expectations, right? Obviously, the games that are more timing sensitive and difficult to master. Um, you're going to start measuring it against the path of skill development, and then look to the game in terms of how it's messaging what I should be doing. Big no-nos for them are telling you to do the wrong thing. And then on the casual side of things, it's just totally different, right? That generally completely not time sensitive at all. Well, time sensitive, like you should come back tomorrow, maybe. And that's a different kind of thing, right? It's that me remembering to wash my clothes is sometimes more similar to some of those old school mobile games than me being able to throw a ball into a hoop. But they're both those skills can be made interesting to explore, and that's kind of what games are for, right? Games are there to take activity patterns and make them interesting. And at the very least, so what is that casual game trying to get me to do, and what is it doing to try to make it interesting? And sure, sometimes it's just like we'll give you more coins, and you can use those coins to buy funny hats and cat pictures. That's not bad, honestly. That's kind of, let's say I spent 45 seconds a day playing that game. I might get a good, very positive 45 seconds out of it. Now, if I played that game for an hour straight, though, I might want to, my eyes might be bleeding from the repetition
Mm-hmm.
and like the lack of things to do. But that's another thing about those games when they're done well. They don't let you necessarily, or they create an impression that it is time to stop playing. You have played this
Mm-hmm.
session out. When you come back tomorrow, when the potential for this repetition has worn off, come back and we'll give you a reward, right? Those are the things to be looking out for and whether
Mm-hmm.
they work with you. If you're immediately hostile to those kinds of techniques, you're not in any position to analyze that kind of game. And the same goes the other direction, by the way. People that play those games extensively, they almost certainly have no tools at their disposal to analyze Dark Souls. They start the game, and then within a few seconds, they're like, "I don't understand any of this," and then they die, and then they die again, and they're like, "So this is what's fun for you? Like playing a game that makes no sense and dying a few times? I don't know. I think my game about getting cat pictures is nicer." And so if you get too fixated on any of those
Mm-hmm.
perspectives, you're obviously going to have kind of you're going to be at a loss when it comes to analyzing what the voice of the author is and whether they're executing kind of
Yeah.
along their intended path effectively.
Yeah. And I think with complexity, I think that has its own unique share of challenges because, like as you were saying earlier, with the example of like games that don't have a tutorial, that it's all kind of baked in organically. Like those are some of the hardest games to I think really nail because it's such a razor line you have to walk in terms of giving the player enough to learn versus as we said like you're almost kind of tricking the player into thinking that they're doing this all on their own when you've in actuality you've set things up to hopefully guide them to the right clues. And I have to ask, did you play or see any footage of that game Ancestors, the Humankind Odyssey?
Ancestors? No, I don't think so. That does not sound familiar.
That was a game released last year where you control pre man. You're like controlling like
Oh,
monkeys and apes.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So I saw the advertising and materials, and I saw the trailer for this game. That was a
Yeah.
while ago.
Yeah, and like that game tried to do everything so organically that I don't think it worked. Like I felt like it didn't give the player the building blocks they really need to get started. And this is, I think, always a challenge of difficult or complicated games. That, as we said, like as a developer, you are incredibly versed, or I hope you're very versed on the game that you're trying to make. But trying to explain that to somebody, I think again, like this is a uh, great, I think, comparison to this overall topic of studying and analyzing game design. That being able to analyze design means that you're able to then convey that information to other people. And I think that is very crucial for trying to build a complicated or unique game. It's something that we've said many times over here that you need to learn the rules before you can break them. And why typically like some of like the very best examples of some of the games we've played have been developers who love a genre so much that they know what works and what doesn't work for them, and then they say, I'm going to do something entirely different because I already know how this all I guess that expression, taking something apart and being able to understand how to put it back together again.
Yeah, as kind of, I guess my parting statement for the stream, something I say to designers when I get them kind of underneath me, um, is that if you can't, if someone doesn't understand what you're saying about what you're trying to do,
Mm-hmm.
it can't be described as a failure on their part. Your job is that of the designer. You
Yes.
need to successfully explain it. You need to get on the same page. If you can't explain it in person, how is what you make going to explain it? If you can't get your coworkers to understand what you're doing, how would you get a player to understand what you're doing? All these things, all we're doing, like even the construction of a game, probably the construction of anything, is kind of can be described as a description, right? If I built a house, I'm just very faithfully describing a house. If I built a game, I'm describing something by making that game. If I can't describe to you how I'm going to do it or why I'm going to do it or what a person's going to go through, then I'm leaving it up to chance. And that's okay because big chunks of what we do are left up to chance
Yep.
because it's all complicated and we can't 100% know the future. Uh, but you can't use the excuse that it's their fault when it's your job.
And I'm sure you as well, we've all heard these horror stories of developers like at cons or showing their games to people like saying, it's, you don't understand, this game is fine, I get it, so surely, the problem is on your end why this game isn't working for you.
But that's just an experience. And
Mm-hmm.
honestly, there's plenty of people in the big teams that's they're never we're never guided or given guidance on how to take our own knowledge seriously or take our own judgments seriously. And that doesn't mean I'm making a judgment because I think it's right. I'm making a judgment because that's my job. And
Yep.
whether it's right or wrong is dependent on the truth. And
Mm-hmm.
then we keep trying to get better. It's a harsh environment for yourself because it's scary. You feel like you don't have a safety net, and also you have to back away from your emotional desire to protect yourself and defend yourself and fight for what you think is right, and instead take a step back and listen more. It's tricky. It took
Right.
me it took me way too long to get comfortable with that.
Oh yeah, and again, the old expression, being able to kill your darlings, and being able to sit there and have someone say, "I don't like your game," and not immediately think, scream at this person for the next 10 minutes about how dare you insult my idea, and again, like that is, I think, a crucial lesson in all walks of life, being able to accept criticism and I think understand, like we said, the difference, being able to separate the emotion of the project versus what's actually there.
Totally agreed.
All right, but I think that is a perfect capper for for this cast. And like I said, if you are free, I would love to have you on. Like, we could certainly do like a regular show, or maybe like a every other week, every 2 weeks kind of thing, talking
Yeah.
more about the design process and bringing more games into it as well. Now that we've had this kind of initial thought on it.
Yeah, I'd like to. I think that makes some sense. Like maybe let's try to find one of the days of the week and maybe set up a biweekly thing. And because I've been thinking about doing something along these lines on our own stream for Epic Tavern, and
Yeah.
well, I've just been thinking about it a lot. Figured out how to get two of us on the stream.
Yeah, that sounds very interesting. I'm sure, like I said, I'm sure everyone would love more of us like just ranting about design topics on a week by or even a bi-weekly basis.
That's a good move, Chris Garrison.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing is we make games to bring people in, not push them away. So we should be
Yeah.
practicing bringing people in all the
Mm.
time.
Yeah, and there's so many really good topics we brought up that we could easily like. Again, that's the thing about these kinds of game design talks. Every topic we talk about brings up another hour and a half discussion that we could then add on, and then it just repeats, and
Totally.
the cast just goes on endlessly. Which, again, like the people watching, that's what they're waiting to see. Just like a cast that just never ends.
Well, well, Drakon just said bye bye, and I think maybe we can take that lead. It
Mm.
is It's been an hour and a half. It's a good cutoff time for me.
All right. So, as always, we'll be wrapping things up here. If you'd like to follow me again for the regulars, you'll find about our Discord and Patreon. But for the new people, that is a link down below. You can follow me on Twitter at GWBeister. And if you are a developer working on an upcoming game or have thoughts on design, would like to come on, we're always looking for new guests. For you, Tomo, what are the best places they can find you or any social media you would like to plug?
So on Twitter, we're at Epic Tavern, and we have a Discord channel, epictavern.gg, Discord Epic Tavern, and on Twitch you can find us at Epic Tavern, Twitch TV/Epic Tavern. And on Twitch, we do streams of development 3 times a week on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 4 to 5 Pacific time. It was a pleasure being on the stream, and thanks for having me.
Not a problem. So, we'll talk more about this off stream, about maybe setting up some kind of regular schedule. And again, whether we can do it or not, I'm sure we'll be more than happy to have you back on for any other design topics that come up.
For sure. And whenever the next roundtable happens, I'm sure that'll be awesome.
All right. So, folks, we're going to end things here. I'll be back later tonight for our regular game streams. Come back for daily discussions on game design here and on game wisdom, where some of the art and science of games. Have a great night, everybody, and I'll see you later.
Bye, guys.